I'm delighted to say that joining me now to discuss the fear that has been spread over coronavirus and the management of it, I've got to say, is the author of that article and Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Nick, congratulations on your column today in The Australian. You brought a bit of contextual history into it, and it's so accurate because the new Delta variant is more akin to the flu, which we've managed for eons in the recent history.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's early days yet, Corey, and you don't want to jump to conclusions, but certainly in Britain, where they've had tens of thousands of cases of the Delta variant, it does seem clear that the mortality rate, the chances of dying if you get it, is considerably smaller than the Alpha variant. I mean, basically, if you're under 50, it's virtually zero. That's according to Public Health UK. So it is mercifully less severe, it seems. Even with older people, you're less likely to die, but very, very transmissible. So we're dealing with a different thing, pretty much like the flu. I mean, if you take 2019, when we had the flu influenza virus, the influenza A, raging through much of Australia, very, very infectious, less fatal, though, than COVID in its early stages. So we're in that sort of zone now. But the other point, and you raised the point very rightly, we've got to judge the risk here. We're in a much safer position now than we were in 2019 because we've invested a lot of time and hats off to the people in aged care in locking down those nursing homes. As you say, 86 nursing homes in South Australia alone had the flu infecting them in 2019. Now we've had, one outbreak in a nursing home here in Sydney a week ago, but that was the first serious outbreak for many, many months. So I think we're in a safe position. Add to that, of course, the vaccine rollout. Almost 3/4 of over 70-year-olds have had at least one jab. And a quarter of them have had two. So that, again, reduces your risk. Every stage reduces your risk. So at what point do you say, well, it becomes ridiculously expensive and demanding to shut down an economy for a diminishing risk?
Yeah, Nick, you raised the point about the diminishing risk and the expense of shutting down an economy. Politicians, we know, like to win elections. And state premiers, most notably in Western Australia, say in Queensland, have proved to be very adept at winning elections by being absolutely stringent and draconian on lockdowns in response to coronavirus. Do you sense there's a political motivation in some of the current thinking about those still to go to an election?
Well, I've not been in politics as you have, Corey. Perhaps I don't have quite as much cynicism. I'm not sure that that's right. It may be around the margins. I think what's happened is that they got stuck into a narrative early on, driven by the public health officials who, as you know, that their definition of 2 months risk is bigger than zero. So they're locked into this. They're the chief advisors. They're taking advice, and they're just in one track sort of progress on this. Whereas we have to get beyond the mindset which we had in April last year, when quite understandably we had no idea of what the COVID was going to do, nor did we have the capability to deal with it in many respects. We're in a very different position. Sure, it's dangerous. Sure, people should get vaccinated. But it's certainly a lot less dangerous to the community as a whole than it was a year ago. And we have to recognise that in taking proportionate response to that.
Yeah, but it does seem there's an acute backlash by those who talk about the proportionate response. I'll congratulate the Prime Minister, because I thought that saying to people, go and have a conversation with your doctor about whether a vaccine is appropriate for you given your age and risk factors, and talking in reference to AstraZeneca, was an entirely reasonable thing to do. But of course the Doctors' Union went crazy. The Chief Health Officer in Queensland over-egged the pudding. And then we had Brad Hazzard, who said last week that we've got to learn to live with this virus, and was howled down and monstered, and then had to sort of retract his statements or say he misspoke. When can we get an injection of rationality and common sense into the discussion, do you think?
Well, at some point we're going to have to, Corey, because we can't go on this forever. We're going to have to look at what's happening in Britain, for instance, where they're opening up despite having large cases. We've got to stop obsessing about cases for a start and start looking at hospitalisations and deaths as a real measure of the seriousness of this. Or look at Singapore, where they're doing exactly the same. They've got a higher vaccine rollout there. But as I say, amongst the vulnerable category here, the vaccine rollout is pretty substantial already and is growing by the day. So I really think we're going to have to get with the plot at some point, because I'm not able to predict the future, but it just seems to me when you get the number of cases you get of the Delta variant, because it's spreading so quickly, it's going to be very hard to shut it down. I mean, it took that lengthy over 100 days lockdown in Victoria last year to close down the Alpha variant, which was less transmissible. How many days is it going to take to close down a more transmissible one? I don't know, but I'm saying that these risk factors, the risk reward, needs to be taken into account instead of this one track, be afraid, be very afraid sort of narrative, which I'm afraid is what we're seeing now.
Yeah, and you make an excellent point, Nick. We have to learn to live with risk. It doesn't matter what it is. It's about the risk of driving a car or crossing a road, of the flu. If you're in a dangerous situation with a personal health crisis, then you've got to respect your own personal circumstances, but you also have to ask for other people to apply this modicum of common sense to it. I mean, there is going to have to be a point where the government is going to, successive state governments are going to have to change their rhetoric and crab walk away from what they've been telling us. Do you have any inclinations as to what the signs of that are going to be? How are they going to change the language without saying we got it so wrong?
Well, I can see, the Prime Minister's already talking about moving to a phase where we can live with it as we live with flu. As you know, in the New South Wales Cabinet, there's a number of ministers who think we should be moving to that stage quicker, sooner rather than later. So there is debate going on. But I think what it's going to take is basically treat us a bit more like adults. This sort of thing from the chief health officers every day, wagging the fingers, pursed lips, lecturing us. Why don't you actually front up and say, what is the, in your considered judgment, is the risk as large as it was last year? Who are the risky groups? Perhaps even tell us, of the 100 and whatever it was cases today, how many of those are under 70? Because if they're under 70, the risk is considerably less. In fact, since this broke out in Australia, for the under 70s, the risk was 1 in 500 that you would die if you caught it, whereas the risk for the over 70s was 1 in 5. So it is a considerably different risk, and we need to know about that. We need to know on what grounds they're taking these very severe, inhuman and illiberal measures.
Yes, I suspect some of the chief health officers and the politicians have actually read a book called How to Make Statistics Mean Whatever You Want Them to, because it's very hard to cut through the muck and the guff and the statistics that are thrown around. People will use them to back their case however it does. So accurate data and an honest interpretation of it, I think, is going to be critical to the future. Nick Cater, your research today I thought was exemplary. I really enjoyed the article, and I want to say thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you, Corey.